So hi everyone, thanks for sticking around if you're still here watching. So this story is a story that I actually recently written. For those who aren't familiar with my work or my passions and what I love doing, I love writing stories. I actually was super afraid to tell stories for many years and never considered myself a storyteller. And then I just figured out that trying to remember how to tell other people's stories was what was my block. And so I started to write my own stories, and then all of a sudden I felt like I could share them more confidently with groups and with children and adults too. Adults love storytelling, admit it. And this one I wanted to write in inspiration of the drawing that we're all showcasing today. That's on the clothing for the pop-up shop that's now open, and the fox and the dandelion, and they're just two beings that I really love, and in a lot of ways symbol signs of spring for me. So this is a brand new story, never before heard by anyone outside of this house. So here we go. It's called A Tale of Dandelion Honey, and there's a reason why tale is spelled that way. That's a little hint. So let me tell you a story. It's one that is set in nature, but probably not what you imagine when I say that, because the story takes place in a city. It's a busy, noisy city where horns honk and sirens are wailing, and there's people always on the move. And they're often distracted by their phones, that they don't ever even notice a dandelion growing in the cracks of a sidewalk. You see, dandelions are one of the world's most resilient and determined of plants. They can thrive and grow almost anywhere, even if people have tried their best to cover the earth with cement. And in this city also lived a fox, a beautiful red fox with a bushy white tail. Wrong direction. A little bit like this one over here that's hanging out with me. And that fox is just as resilient as the dandelion, and clever too, because even though the city where she lived now was a forest when her grandparents were alive, she had adapted really well to the ever-growing sprawl of the urban life. And she had made herself a den in a hole that was dug right next to an old oak tree, large oak tree that had somehow managed to survive in an unyet developed lot in the city's suburbs. And even though the people who passed by thought the area was a waste of space filled with weeds, the fox considered it an oasis. Because the land was left mostly undisturbed by humans, other than the odd soda can thrown in by a littering passerby. The most magical thing would happen there in spring every year. As the weather warmed up and the ground thawed, plants whose roots and seeds were buried beneath a layer of soil would begin to grow, slowly at first, and then with increasing speed as the days lengthened until they eventually flowered. And one of the first to do this was, can you guess? The dandelion. But not just any dandelion in this story. The soil was so rich that the dandelions that grew there sparkled like gold. And their scent, it was so strong that the fox could smell it as soon as it flowered. It was the moment that she waited for every year because she knew what it meant. You see, the fox wasn't the only creature that made their home in this parcel of land in the city. High up in the branches of that old oak tree was a humble hive of honeybees. And as soon as the first golden dandelion flowered, the scent would waft up into the tree and signal to the bees that it was time. They would know it was warm enough again to leave their hives and begin a new season of honey making. Not only did the honey provide plenty of food for the bees and their growing larvae, they were able to produce so much honey that their hive would eventually be dripping as it overflowed with the gooey and delicious treat. And the taste, it was like no honey you have ever tried before. Those dandelions with their beautiful perfume and sparkling flowers provided the sweetest nectar that you could ever taste. The fox knew this, and so with the onset of spring and the blooming of the dandelions and the buzzing of the re-emerging bees. She would eagerly await until that hive was oozing out honey. Then she would sit just beneath it with her mouth open as it dripped, dripped, dripped right onto her tongue. And she would smack her lips and smile with delight. It was truly her favorite part of spring. How the people missed out. No one had a clue that such a wasted space filled with weeds was actually such a source of abundance. And the fox really liked it that way. After all, the forest her grandparents had once lived in was gone forever now. So at least she could enjoy this peaceful life somewhere in the busy, noisy city. Then, one day, while the fox was asleep in her den beside the old oak tree, she heard voices growing louder and louder. She popped her head out of the den. She saw two people walking right through all the dandelions towards the oak tree. They stopped before they got too close. She noticed they had some sort of strange device on their back. It seemed to be filled with a liquid, and they were holding a hose that was connected to it. They walked out into the dandelions, those beautiful golden dandelions, and with the click of a button began to spray them with the liquid. They walked around the whole patch of land, spraying this strange substance everywhere that they went. The fox watched from her den and sniffed as the scent in the air changed from the sweet, sugary nectar to this awful, pungent smell that made her feel like she had to... She managed to muffle her sneeze so the people didn't hear her. And once they were finished spraying, they left. Fox came out of her den and walked over to a dandelion wet with whatever the people had sprayed on it. She sniffed it. Ugh, this can't be good, she thought. What had they done? But the bees still flew out of their hive that day. They continued to collect nectar from the dandelions to make honey, and so the fox tried not to worry too much. But then, over the next few days, everything changed. The dandelions began to shrivel up and die, and took with them their once delicious nectar. And that meant the bees could no longer make honey. And in fact, the honey that they had been making had changed too. It had turned from this golden yellow into a sickly brown. And when the fox caught one of the drops in her mouth, she almost choked. It burned her tongue and made her feel sick. The bees started to get sick too, and the hive began to go quiet. Fox was devastated and angry. Humans had destroyed so much already. How could they destroy her home too? She wanted to do something, and as she thought about what she could do, she felt a twinge in her stomach, and she felt nauseous and weak and realized she had to lay down. She couldn't even make it back to her den, but managed to curl up against the root of the oak tree. She laid there for hours, wondering if she would ever feel better again. She closed her eyes and let out a deep sigh. Thump! Fox's eyes opened wide at the sound. Thump! 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 And a bright orange ball landed right in front of her. Then she heard giggles, and a voice said, "I'll get it!" with a pitter-patter, footsteps coming right towards her. She was so tired and ill that all she could do was barely lift her head to see who was approaching. It was another human, a small one, a child. The child was running towards the ball, and just as they reached down to pick it up, they noticed the fox. And the child froze. The two of them locked eyes, both afraid of one another at first. But then the child's eyes softened, and the fox knew she was safe. So she sighed and flopped her head back down, still nauseous from whatever those people had sprayed on the dandelions. Then the child's face became confused, and then concerned. "Are you okay?" they whispered gently. And then they took another step towards the fox, but she barely moved. And so the child knew something was wrong. Usually a fox would have scampered off by now. She looked so sick and so sad. "Oh no," the child said. "Don't worry, I'll be back." And they ran off again, not even thinking to take the ball that they'd originally come for with them. And true to their word, they did return a short while later with someone else, with an adult. But this human was different from the others that had come with their spray. This adult looked concerned just like the child, and they gently approached the fox and looked very kind. The child said, "This is how I found her. I don't think she's very well." And the adult said, "Yes, I don't think she is either." They removed a bag that they had been carrying on their back and rifled through it. They pulled out a dish and a bottle of water. They poured some water in the dish and they nudged it towards the fox. As soon as she saw it, she realized how thirsty she was. So when it was within reach, she put out her tongue, started to lap up some of the water. And as she drank, the adult stood up and just started to look around the lot where they were. They noticed all of the dying dandelions. And then that smell that was in the air, it smelled like chemicals. And then something dropped from the branches of the oak tree above them, right on their head. It was sticky and brown, and surprised, the adult wiped it from their forehead, wondering what it was. They sniffed it. "It feels like honey," they said, "but it smells awful. And I can see the beehive, but I don't see any bees. I think I know what happened. Someone has sprayed weed killer and the fox and bees have eaten it. And it's killing more than just the dandelions. I've lived in this neighborhood for 20 years and this lot has always been left alone. But since it is right next to the school, I know they've been talking about turning it into a playing field. So I bet they were trying to get rid of the dandelions to plant grass. But they don't realize it's making this place unlivable for wildlife. So I think we could do something about this." Now, by then, the fox had begun to feel a little better. The clean water was soothing her thirst and it was helping to wash those chemicals away. And she was able to stand up and she took herself back to her den where she could rest more comfortably. Then the adult and child decided to leave her, but they both returned the following day. They brought more water and some food and they left it at the opening of her den. And they also looked a little excited and they were carrying something else with them. It was made of wood and it had a post attached to it. And they took out a mallet and they hammered the post into the ground. It was a sign. And the sign said, "No pesticides." Turns out that the adult was a teacher at the school. And after finding the fox, they asked if they could lead a project with the children to turn the lot into a wildlife haven and garden instead of another playing field. And the school had agreed. The sign was the start of the project. So after the humans had left, the fox came out of her den and she looked around at what had become of her home. She knew her home would be safe once again because of them, and she was relieved, but also sad. All the dandelions were gone, and with them, the thriving beehive and delicious honey. As she walked around finding shriveled dandelion after shriveled dandelion, her heart sank further and further. Then eventually she returned to the oak tree. She sat down. She let out a deep, depressed breath. And just as she did that, something white and fluffy flew up in the air before her. It stayed suspended there and then floated off and away. When the fox looked down at where it had come from, she noticed a tiny little dandelion plant, the only one that seemed to have survived. And the flower had turned into fluffy white seeds. And in that same moment, drop! A drop of honey from the hive landed right on the end of the fox's tail. She stared at it and then suddenly had an idea. Fox placed her honey-covered tail on the dandelion seeds, and they stuck to her just like she'd hoped. And then she stood up and she ran all around the lot, flicking her tail from side to side. One by one, the seeds flew off of her tail, floated in the breeze, and landed on the ground. And over the following weeks, dandelions began to grow wherever the seeds had landed. And soon after, the bees returned. And then, did you guess it? Honey making resumed as well. And the school had started to organize class trips where the children helped plant more trees and flowers for insects. And never again did a dandelion or other living being there suffer. And if you went there today, even amidst the hustle and bustle of city life, you might happen to see a fox sitting under an oak tree, their mouth wide open, waiting for drops of dandelion honey. The end.